Hey there, how you doing? I'm Lloyd, and today I'm excited to try out Flammkuchen, a savory flatbread from one of my ancestral regions, Saarland, Germany, on this episode of gen-EAT-alogy. While in German, Flammkuchen literally translates to flame cake, it's also known by its French name, tarte flambée. This bilingual naming isn't surprising, considering Flammkuchen is a traditional dish in the French-German border regions of Alsace, Lorraine, Saarland, the Palatinate, and Baden, and some of those regions have changed hands between German and French multiple times over the last several hundred years, generally as a result of war, with Alsace and Lorraine now part of France, and Saarland, the Palatinate, and Baden now part of Germany. This back and forth can actually be seen in documents relating to my own great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, Johann Nikolaus Benninger and his wife Elisabetta, who lived in Bexbach, Saarland, around the late 17 and early 1800s. Since this area was conquered by the French in 1792, their marriage documents from 1807 are written in French, and Johann Nikolaus is referred to as Jean-Nicolas, but records from after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, such as the birth registrations for their children and Johann's own death registration in 1844, are written in German, as Bexbach was then part of the Kingdom of Bavaria. I have no doubt that Johann, Elisabetta, and their children would have been well familiar with Flammkuchen, as they were traditionally made by farmers in those regions who, while preparing to bake their weekly bread, would put a flat piece of dough in the oven, and depending on how fast it cooked, they could tell whether the oven was too hot or needed more heat. While I wasn't able to find any recipes for Flammkuchen from before the 20th century, I did find written mentions of it going back to at least the 1500s. The lack of recipes is probably due to the fact that it was generally eaten by farmers and their families, so there wasn't really any need to write down how to cook something that everyone learned how to make growing up. That and the fact that humans have been putting toppings on pieces of flat bread for thousands of years means Flammkuchen was probably around long before it was ever written about. The earliest mentions that I could find were in the writings of Swiss physician Bartholomäus Charakter in his Treatise on the German Pantry. But our hearts don't like such Flammkuchen. Everything has to be fried in special pans and molds, otherwise they couldn't perform their services with bad unseasoned Flammkuchen roasted in ashes. I only translated a small portion of his writing, so I'm not sure if he's saying that poorly made Flammkuchen are bad for the heart, or if he was just a bit bougie. Being a food made by farmers as kind of a weekly treat, there isn't even really one established way to make the dough for Flammkuchen. One of the biggest differences is that some people use yeast and others do not. While on the one hand, it could be argued that if you're simply testing the heat of the oven, you would just need a simple unleavened dough. But on the other hand, if you're already making loaves of bread, you'd probably just test the oven using spare bread dough that you have. And in fact, references to Flammkuchen in the past mention it being made from ordinary bread dough. That being the case, using a leavened dough would probably be more historically authentic, although throughout most of history, doughs were actually leavened more like sourdough using naturally occurring yeasts and bacteria rather than the dry yeast commonly found today. But since I like a bit of experimentation and comparison, I'm making two different doughs, one with yeast, one without, and each of these recipes should result in enough dough for 2 Flammkuchen. For the leavened dough, you'll need 225 grams, or about 1 3/4 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon salt, 1 teaspoon sugar, 7 grams, or about 2 1/4 teaspoons of active dry yeast, 2 tablespoons of oil. You can use olive oil if you want, but a more neutral oil like canola or grapeseed would be more authentic to what would have been historically available in the region. And 125 milliliters, or a little over half a cup of warm water. Since we're using yeast, the water does need to be warm, but not too hot, otherwise that could kill the yeast. For the unleavened dough, you'll need 200 grams, or about 1 1/2 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon salt, 1 1/2 teaspoons oil, and 110 milliliters, or a little less than half a cup of water. The process of making the doughs is pretty much the same. In a bowl, mix your dry ingredients together. Since nowadays, active dry yeast doesn't need proofing, you can just add it and the sugar directly, but follow the directions on your packaging if you do want to proof it. Add the oil and water and mix everything together. If you've got a hand mixer with a dough hook attachment, you can use it, but if you want to do things the old school way, I didn't find it too difficult to mix by hand. If the dough is too sticky, add a little more flour. If it's too dry, add a little more water. Once the dough starts to come together, knead into a smooth ball. Once you've got a smooth ball of dough, put it in a bowl, cover with a cloth, and leave it in a warm area to rest. The leavened dough will need about an hour to rest, and the unleavened dough just needs a half an hour. Preheat the oven to 480 degrees Fahrenheit or 250 degrees Celsius. Now, if you have a pizza stone, I highly recommend using it because it'll better replicate the stone ovens people would have used back in the day to bake their bread. If you do have a pizza stone, put it in the oven and preheat to 500 degrees Fahrenheit or 260 degrees Celsius. However, I know that most people don't have pizza stones, so for this demonstration, I'm just going to be using a sheet pan. So while the doughs are resting and the oven is preheating, we can go ahead and prepare our toppings. Now, the great thing about a dish like this is that you can really top it with whatever you want. There are different regional varieties with different meats and cheeses, as well as sweet versions with toppings like cinnamon and apples. And if you're making this at home, you can really get creative with it. For this video, however, I'm going with what's probably considered the most traditional version. Creme fraiche, bacon, onions. In fact, writings going back hundreds of years attest to these really being the classic toppings for Flammkuchen. In a book from 1840 about the history of the city of Reutlingen in Baden, Christopher Geiler writes, "The above-mentioned flatbreads, Flammkuchen, with bacon and onions, were baked there, and the lowest hut was filled with their lovely aroma." So, for the Flammkuchen toppings, you'll need 200 grams or about 1.5 cups of creme fraiche or sour cream. If you're using sour cream, that's totally fine. Just make sure it's not the light version. Half of a medium-sized onion, 100 grams of thick-cut bacon, which for me was 3 strips. Regular smoked bacon is probably going to be the most historically authentic, but really you can use whatever kind of bacon you want. Just make sure it's the thick cut. That's going to work best here. Salt, pepper, nutmeg. These are for seasoning the creme fraiche, and so it's really up to you how much to use. If you're new to cooking, just season a little bit, taste it, add a little bit more, and repeat until you like the flavor. To make the topping, cut the onion into thin slices, thin being important because the Flammkuchen doesn't cook for very long and raw onion isn't the flavor we're going for. Likewise, cut the bacon into strips, small enough so that you've got enough to top 2 Flammkuchen. Put your creme fraiche or sour cream in a bowl, season with salt, pepper, and nutmeg. Then mix everything together so the seasoning is well incorporated and you've got a smooth, spreadable cream. And now that everything's ready, it's time to construct the Flammkuchen. Take your ball of dough, cut it in half, and form another dough ball. Lay down a piece of parchment paper and dust it with a little flour. If you're using a pizza stone and you have a pizza peel, it may be easier to do this all on the peel. Place your dough onto the parchment paper and roll it out thin. Another advantage of a rustic dish like this is that it doesn't need to be perfectly round, just a mostly oblong or rectangular shape will do. Once the dough is rolled out, spread on a layer of creme fraiche and top with the bacon and onion. If you're using a sheet pan, transfer the Flammkuchen, parchment and all, onto the pan. If there's some extra parchment hanging off the pan, I'd suggest cutting it off, otherwise it could burn. If you're using a stone, put only the Flammkuchen on the stone. It might be a bit too hot for the parchment. Cook on the bottom rack for about 10 to 12 minutes, keeping an eye on it to make sure the crust doesn't burn. When your Flammkuchen is done, pull it out, cut into slices, and guten Appetit. And now to give these both a try, along with this refreshing German beer, which, although not from Saarland, is from Brauerei Füllung in Baden, which is a traditional Flammkuchen region, so I think it's all right. First, to give the leavened version a try. And then the unleavened version. Okay. So for both, the crust is nice and crispy, while still kind of chewy in the middle, but fully cooked through. So the leavened dough is a little airier. It's got a little bit more of that yeasty bread flavor, but Honestly, they're both really good. I think if you were in a rush and didn't want to wait for the dough to rise, you could go with the unleavened dough, not have any regrets. As for the topping, it's not a combination I would have ever thought of without researching this video, but it really works. The smokiness of the bacon, you get the caramelized flavor from the onions that are almost like semi-sauteed in the creme fraiche. And then the creme fraiche itself, I put a good deal of pepper and nutmeg into mine. So it's got a really nice spiced flavor that plays really well with the savoriness of the bacon. Again, not a combination I would have ever thought of on my own, but it really, really works. The only thing is the bacon doesn't get real crispy because of the short cooking time. I think you could solve that by maybe cooking the bacon a little bit before putting it on top of the Flammkuchen, but you would want to make sure you don't cook it too much or it'll probably burn while the Flammkuchen is cooking. This is really good. I will be making this plenty from now on. Really, you could put whatever you wanted to on here, like I said earlier, but I would highly recommend using the traditional toppings first. You might love it. Thank you so much for watching. I've got a lot more recipes to explore and share, so if you liked this video, please like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Gen-EAT-alogy. Prost!